You're moderating today, is that right?
I am. I am, with occasional input from the dog,
Well
for which I apologize. But yes, I am happy to do so. Rebecca has been attending colloquia several times, so she knows the drill now. So hi everyone, and we're delighted that our colloquium speaker today is Professor Rebecca Bratspies. She is professor of law at City University of New York School of Law and the founding director of CUNY's Center for Urban Environmental Reform. Her career has featured both active scholarship and active community engagement, including engaged research projects such as the one she'll be sharing with us today. Among her books, the most recent one is called Environmental Justice, Law, Policy, and Regulation. I was especially delighted and intrigued to learn that she has also created or co-created 3 educational comic books. We All Count, Maya's Lot, and Bina's Plant. And that's close to our heart here at the workshop, where Scott and Emily have been working on a children's book lately.
Oh, cool.
The comics books are not necessarily targeted only to children, but for today, though, no comic books. We're here to listen and discuss with Professor Bratspies her paper on air quality, waste disposal, and the urban commons. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rebecca Bratspies.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy days to think through this project with me. And as a bonus, in case you're interested, the environmental justice comics are available for free download on our website. I'll share the link with you a little bit later. So anybody who wants to check them out can. And we are making a 4th one right now, which is about the Green New Deal. Anyway, let me get started. I'm going to share my screen, and I have some slides that I want to share with you. Let's see, I'm going to do this. And show beginning. And it always does it backwards, so forgive me. Give me a second. Don't know why I can't get that to work properly, but hi. Okay, so first of all, I am so honored to be here, and I want to explain sort of how I got into this particular kind of thinking. I'm pretty new to commons theory. I attended the Georgetown conference in 2018 celebrating the urban commons, and I contributed a chapter to the book that came out of that about managing the urban canopy as a commons. And it got me really interested in the power of commons thinking to promote environmental justice by transforming policy discussions under existing law and regulations, and also as a vehicle for trying to create new, better regulatory systems that create space for community decision-making and respect a wider array of claims to the city. So with that preface, New York City has been struggling with waste equity for a long, long time. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to very quickly give you a tour of some of the key legal and regulatory milestones, and then turn to the particular project that has me thinking about these questions in context. And then I'm hoping to pick your brains and learn from you about how commons thinking can advance our waste equity goals in New York City and beyond. So we're going to start in 2003. And this policy, which is a Department of Environmental Conservation policy, came out of a huge fight in New York City in 2000 over the siting of peaker plants. And 10 peaker plants were sited on an emergency basis across New York City with virtually no environmental assessment. They got an exception to Article 10, which is the siting law in New York, on a technicality, and promised that these peaker plants would be temporary. It was a 3-year proposal to deal with a so-called emergency. You may remember in 2000, California was suffering rolling blackouts. And while it was pretty clear that at the time that was due to market manipulation rather than shortage, the Pataki administration pushed for the siting of these facilities. all of them, all 10 of them, were cited in already overburdened low-income communities of color, in environmental justice communities. And the citing was done with no community consultation and over vehement community objection. There was an intense political outcry, and one of the earliest responses was Commissioner Policy 29 from Department of Environmental Conservation, which committed the DEC to environmental justice. And one of the key things that it did was it identified environmental justice areas where additional layers of scrutiny should be applied in permitting. So that happened in 2003. Then in 2006, New York City, after decades of advocacy by environmental justice communities, adopted a transformative solid waste management plan. And the key principles of this plan was a borough-based approach. The idea was that every borough of the city was going to be responsible for its own waste. When the plan was adopted in 2006, Manhattan produced the most waste of all the 5 boroughs in New York City and had exactly 0 waste transfer stations. It held none of its own waste. And this waste management plan also committed the city to transforming its waste handling plan from truck-based transport to rail and barge-based transport to reduce environmental impacts across a host of vectors. Now, in the paper, I go into some detail about this notion of transporting waste out of state and the idea of finding a place to be away. But I'm not going to talk about that right now because I really want to talk specifically about these 2 waste transfer stations that we're studying and how they fit into the broader context. So here's a map of where the waste transfer stations were at the time. This map was actually created in 2009 by one of my CUNY colleagues, but it reflects the state of existence at 2006 because nothing had happened in 2009. And you can see there's a large cluster of waste transfer stations here in the North Bronx. These 2 dots here, the green dots, are what we're actually going to talk about today. At the time, the waste transfer stations were in 3 basic neighborhoods, and 75% of New York City's waste was handled between the North Bronx, the South Bronx, North Brooklyn, and Southeast Queens. These 2 waste transfer stations were responsible for handling 10% of New York City's waste. Now I'd like to direct your attention just briefly to the red dots because those are the proposed solution. Those are the new waste transfer stations that are going to be added under this plan in wealthier, whiter communities to begin to shift the inequity of the burden that these waste transfer stations were imposing on communities. Now, specifically, I want to direct your attention to this dot on the east side, Upper East Side of Manhattan. That was the biggest fight. And ultimately, it took a long time for the 91st Street Waste Transfer Station to be opened. It took until 2019. It was a massive drawn out fight. The community rallied against it. And when it did open in 2019, it handled 25% less waste than was proposed in 2006. And that was because in response to this proposal to site a waste transfer station here on the Upper East Side, there had been a tremendous reduction in waste generation in this community. So yay for that, right? I show you this picture for comparison's sake. I want you to keep it in mind when we turn to Jamaica. And in particular, I want you to note that this is fully enclosed. On the other side of this picture, there's a walking biking path that runs along the facility. It connects the asphalt green park, which is over here, with Randall's Island Bridge, which crosses a walking bridge that crosses over to Randall's Island. Thousands of people use that park on a regular, use that path on a regular basis. And from personal experience, I can tell you there's no smell, there are no particulates, and there's no awareness unless you're paying attention to the signs that there's a large waste transfer station next door. I tell you that because it shows this is possible. So 2 more brief laws, and then we'll look at the situation in Jamaica. So in 2017, New York City enacted 2 environmental justice laws. They do a lot of things, but these are the key provisions for our purposes. They require the city to conduct a comprehensive study to assess the current state of environmental justice. and to create an environmental justice map that identifies environmental justice communities. Established an EJ board. I had the honor of serving on that EJ board. And right now we're in the information gathering phase for conducting the study that will result in a plan, an environmental justice plan for moving the city forward. And modeling the set of concerns I want to talk about with you today, I want to talk just about how the EJ Advisory Board is functioning. The legislative task of the EJ Board, what the local law says that we're supposed to do, is to respond to drafts produced by the city and give an environmental justice perspective. However, we wanted community voices to be involved in creating the draft, not just responding to it. So the Environmental Justice Advisory Board has been just held the very first citywide town hall on environmental justice, and hundreds of people joined us via Zoom for more than 2 hours to share their concerns. It was translated into Spanish. We had simultaneous translation into Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese. There was Arabic translation available as well, but it wasn't simultaneous. And we've created an online and a mail and telephone survey to collect information to feed into the draft plan to try to bring community voices into the beginning of the development of the planning, rather than responding to plans that are created on a technocratic citywide basis. So that is sort of what I'm hoping we can think about more broadly. But before we get there, I want to show you also the waste equity law. So in 2018, 12 years after the 2006 solid waste plan was created, New York City finally passed the waste equity bill. And it had been introduced in 2006 and been reintroduced and reintroduced, and it took 12 years until it was enacted. But this codifies portions of the solid waste management plan, and importantly, lowers the cap on trash that can be trucked into and out of the overburdened neighborhoods that were identified in the 2006 solid waste plan. But there's a battle over on another front right now, which is the next step in this process is a zoned franchising system for waste hauling that will hopefully impose stricter regulation on the industry in terms of truck routes, number of truck miles, and age of truck engines. And the idea is to further alleviate burdens on the affected communities. But there's a loophole in this bill that we've just discovered is of direct impact to this community. And that is that while this bill by law capped the amount and reduced the amount of waste that could be sent into the 3 hardest hit communities, there's a loophole that a waste transfer station that switches from truck to rail or marine transport can request an increase in capacity. And right now, there are moves by the 2 waste transfer stations that we're going to talk about to take advantage of that loophole and increase their capacity. So we're actually scrambling much more than we thought we would. When I started this project, it was much more about how to ameliorate the impacts that these existing facilities had. And now it's not only how do we ameliorate the impacts, but how do we prevent increased impacts? So this is a study of the 2 dots that I pointed out in Queens, the 2 waste transfer stations. And this project grew in an interesting fashion. Over the summer, I participated remotely in a community roundtable that was sponsored by the Eastern Queens Alliance, which is a local environmental justice group. I was on a panel with Peggy Shepard of We Act and Dr. Robert Bullard. It was really a little bit out of my class, but I was honored to be there with them. After the event, a community member and a member of the Queens Solid Waste Advisory Board reached out to me and asked for help with responding to environmental conditions from this waste transfer station. And at the same time, a high school teacher who'd been in the audience also reached out to me about advice for incorporating service learning about environmental justice into her science class. And so that was sort of the start of this project. This is our team as of now. We put together a pilot project grant that was funded through Mount Sinai's environmental pediatrics program. And so our project is to analyze the impacts of these two waste transfer stations on the facilities. So let's look at the area. This is the DEC Environmental Justice Map, and the white circle shows where the waste transfer stations are and the immediate environs. The area is also identified by the city as an environmental justice area in the 2017 environment map that was required by the environmental justice laws. And you can see more than 90% of the residents are people of color. The broader area is 97%. The percentage that live below the poverty line is roughly a quarter. In the immediate environs of the waste transfer station, though, it's 1/3 of the residents live below the poverty line. This area has one of the highest levels of food insecurity and rent burden in the city, and is an area that was hard hit by COVID. So let's look at the zoning map. This is it. Again, the red circle at the top is where the two waste transfer stations are. The pink color signals an M1 district, light manufacturing, and yellow is residential, and green is a park. Now, you can see that the close proximity of these facilities to the public park and to residential areas, mostly 1 and 2 family houses. This park is the only large green space in the vicinity. It's got ball fields, playgrounds, and in New York City, typically waste transfer stations are located in M3 districts. They're districts that are designated for heavy industry that generate noise, traffic, and pollution. And even in M3 districts, there are fairly rigid performance standards that these facilities are supposed to comply with. And because they're in M3 zones, they're typically buffered from residential areas. Here you can see there's no buffer. These are in the in an M1 residential district, and there's no buffer between the noxious use and the residential area. So let's look at the facilities themselves. Now, remember that 91st Street transfer station I showed you? Well, this is what the waste transfer station looks like in Jamaica. Technically, it has 4 walls, but the front doors here are kept unrolled, kept rolled up 24/7, 6 days a week. And this is the only unenclosed waste facility in New York City that's in an M1 zone. In 2003, when the DEC commissioner issued Policy 29, the residents in Jamaica were locked in a conflict with the waste transfer station over the burdens that this facility and the one directly adjacent to it pose on the community in terms of waste, noise, pollution, traffic, and odor. The primary concerns in our study are dust, odor, leachate, and noise. So this is the high-tech leachate management system and dust management system that the facility uses. Let me see if I can get this video to work. It was not cooperating before. I can't. Okay. What you would see, if you could see the video, was this guy with the hose spraying water around. That's pretty much it. Let's see. So here's a look down Douglas Avenue. This is a platted public street that separates the two waste transfer station. You can see that the leachate management system leaves something to be desired, as does the dust and PM10, PM2.5 management system. Here's a view from the other direction. This is, instead of a photograph that I took, this is just a Google Streets view from a different day, just to show you that this problem of leachate management is an ongoing one. It's not one-off, it's pretty much every day. PM2.5, as I'm sure all of you know, is a grave health threat that's a leading cause of mortality worldwide. You can see the PM10 coding everything here. And where there's PM10, there's almost always PM2.5 as well, though PM2.5 you wouldn't be able to see. So this is looking the other way down Douglas Avenue towards Regal Recycling, the other facility. Again, this is a public street. One of the things I'm hoping for some help thinking about is how commons arguments to the street, right? The right to the street might be helpful here. And that's the next phase of the paper that I'm working on. So the impacts on this community have been significant. This is just some of the statistics. You can see that infant mortality in Jamaica is much higher than the city average and staggeringly higher than the part of the city with the fewest of such deaths. Avoidable hospitalizations means those that could be avoided with timely access to quality outpatient care. And you can see that the rate here is much higher than the rest of the city and is about an order of a magnitude higher than the least impacted areas. And these slides of health effects, the next one's about adults, reflect the aggregate effects of both the pollution from these two facilities, but also the poor quality housing, the food insecurity, the lack of access to medical care, among other drivers that combine together to put this community in a particularly vulnerable situation. And that I'm particularly interested in thinking about how can we facilitate planning from the beginning that incorporates the voices and needs of these community members so that we wind up in a different place than the one we seem to wind up in over and over again, which is these communities overburdened and unable to escape that situation. So here's some statistics about adults. You can see there's a much higher avoidable hospitalization rate than for the rest of the city. And the Jamaica residents die prematurely at a higher rate than people do in other parts of the city. EJ screen of the area shows that how the environmental indicators and demographics come together in this location. You can see that this neighborhood ranks among the most vulnerable in the state, in the region, and in the country for every variable considered by EJ screen. I should say that blue is the United States, green is the state, and orange is the region. For some reason, I see that the index was cut off. I apologize for that. So this is the excess risk that we're seeking to remedy. And in particular, I would point out the hazardous waste proximity. You can see that this community is seriously overburdened. And so I have two questions for you. I'm going to stop now because I really want to leave as much time as possible for discussion. But I have two questions for you that come from the paper. And the first one is, do you think, and this is genuinely a question, do you think that the emerging human right to breathe clean air is something that could be of use in the context of making a commons argument? It obviously has use in the environmental justice context, but I'm wondering if that right could be the foundation of a more vigorous commons claim to the airshed in this area and across the city. And then also, sort of more generally, how does commons theory offer new avenues for advocacy around this and other environmental justice issues? So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm really eager to hear what you guys have to say. Like I said, I'm relatively new to commons thinking, and I am eager to learn from you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Appreciate the presentation, as well as giving us some questions to think about. So yes, first we'll thank you. And second, as I posted in the chat a little while ago, just sort of standard protocols for today, we will, I'll look for people in either the raise hand list or in the chat list. And we get to start today with Brian. So Brian, go ahead.
Okay, good. It was an interesting paper to read. First, just a comment, particularly since you're talking about nuisance and nuisance law, then certainly it would seem appropriate to look at Carol Rose's work in Property and Persuasion, where she lays out nuisance, regulation, and commons as kind of three different regulatory modes and institutional choice. Okay, then the question I had prepared is the first part of the paper reads like this success story. Things have really changed. So it would be interesting to have more explanation of what changed, which parts of that may be political dynamics, economics, or since what you're clearly proposing is a shift in kind of discourse, framing the issue now as a commons, to what extent environmental justice or related discourse kind of framings made a difference. Okay, having been polite and constructive and so on, I'm going to be potentially controversial here. And as somebody who co-edited 2 books on water rights at the same time as there were a bunch of people out there extremely concerned to establish a human right to water, which finally got recognized through a UN process around 2010. There are a whole bunch of people who very sincerely believe this is extremely important in terms of establishing international norms and are willing to put a whole lot of effort into it. As someone who's worked as a practitioner, frankly, I feel those efforts really, competed with, distracted from, took up attention compared to ways of thinking about recognizing water rights in more specific operational ways, including for traditional communities and irrigators. So I think there's some trade-offs, but it may be hard to find any kind of good framework for comparing between the worldviews of those people who kind of believe in those human rights standards versus people who may take a shorter term, a more pragmatic approach, or not as convinced. And so far, I'm not seeing the benefits one would have wanted to hope from the recognition of a human right to water. Maybe it's happening, especially in India and other places where the legal system makes a difference. And obviously in the US, the legal system might make a difference. Apologies for going on at some length. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I tend to be somewhat skeptical about human rights claims as anything other than a rhetorical tool. But I think as a rhetorical tool, the idea that people have the right to breathe air that isn't going to make them sick has a lot of power. And I think that personally, and also we've seen that in terms of survey data, that when questions are posed to people in terms of should every child have the right to breathe air that isn't going to make them sick, we see overwhelming numbers of people across whatever divides you can think of say, yes, that should be the way we make policy. So I tend to be really pragmatic, and I see this as a tool for changing the discourse rather than a legal right that we're going to realize in some fashion, certainly here in the United States at least. But I do take that point, and that's part of the reason I wanted to talk with you about the question. A lot of people who read this early draft were like, yeah, just take that out. So I'm still holding to it, but if none of you buy it, I want to hear that too.
Okay, if I can follow up briefly, come back to the other question I asked. A way to support the argument that the rhetoric would make a big difference is if reframing issues as environmental justice rather than just NIMBY or who's going to get the waste station. If the argument is framing things in terms of environmental justice made a big difference, then that would support an argument to say putting effort into framing things in terms of a right to breathe clean air could also make a difference.
Yeah, well, I think there's no question in New York City, at least, that the framing of waste equity has transformed the conversation. And I think that has spread to New York State as well. We see in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that energy equity is really at the core of the law itself. So I think that the idea that environmental justice can be a central organizing point for making societal choices about the negative externalities that affect all of us is a very powerful one, at least in this particular context. I'm not sure that that translates to the human right to breathe clean air. I think that's a little more rarefied, but it certainly is an integral part of environmental justice, as environmental justice is that everybody has a basic right to live in an environment that isn't going to harm their health. Thank you very much for those comments. And yeah, I agree that I need to engage a lot more with Carol Rose's book. There's also a really good new article that just came out called Turning Neighbors into Nuisances. That is a really interesting take on this that is going to, I think, help me.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Sure.
The queue right now, I have Ken Richards up next and Nicholas Almendaris up after Ken. So Ken, it's yours.
Great, thanks, Bill. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us. This is wonderful and very thought-provoking paper. And you know, we get this range of work coming in through the colloquium, you know, all the way from kind of an initial idea, a little more in an outline, all the way to published books. And this is obviously at that beginning phase, which is great because it means we actually get to contribute a little bit in the formation of these new works. So as I was going through your paper, perhaps drawing an analogy from your work on children's literature, I found myself playing the equivalent of "Where's my thesis?" and or "Are you my thesis?"
Uh-huh.
And so I was going through and I found several points along the way where I said, I think this is the thesis. Now that's totally appropriate for this stage of the work, but the next stage is, what is it you're really trying to say? And I think I found it. It was the first sentence of the conclusion: framing air pollution and odor problem as a commons problem and residents as commoners offers a way to go beyond the limitation of nuisance law and help us see new problems or new solutions. So I think that sort of summarized what you were trying to do. And then the next question is, are you doing it? And I found myself at several points along the way needing more convincing that the commons problem was actually going to give us those new insights you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
At each stage, as you described these issues, I found myself thinking, wait a minute, isn't that just a political representation, a resource dedication, and a poor administration problem? How do those go away when we switch this to a commons problem? Or how are they addressed? And I think the answer is that it goes to the fundamental assignment of rights. That is, do I have a right to clean air? Or do I have, or do you have a right to put a transfer station in my neighborhood? And only if I can indicate a certain level of infringement on my assigned right do I get to sue you. And so I would encourage you to sort of play out the contrast. We don't even have a label on the current approach. And you know, so it's a little hard to actually say, what are you contrasting? The fundamental question is, can we shift to a commons approach and gain? But what are we shifting from? How do you decide that? And what exactly is it that changes when you make that change, other than some new terms that may not be well defined? The other thing is, I kept looking at this. My wife does a great deal of community engagement kind of work. And I was thinking, well, the real problem here is there's just no community engagement. But that doesn't mean we need to shift out of a commons or shift to a commons framing of this from whatever we're in now. it means we need to do a better job administering what we have now. And so I guess I'm rambling here a bit, but I'm trying to get at this sort of, can we better define where we're at now? And what is it that would actually change when we go to the commons, a very concrete laying out? Thanks. I'll shut up now.
No, not at all. Thanks, Ken. And Rebecca, before you respond, Jess Steinberg just wanted to add in something to Ken's question, and then maybe you can reply to both. And then Nicholas, thanks for being patient. You're up next.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, and I'll make this really quick. But I sort of seconded Ken's question about the central thesis, especially because I was left wondering, thinking about what is the good exactly that we're talking about in the context of a commons problem, right? So you talk a lot about clean air and breathing, but we also actually have a land problem as well, right? Because you have to allocate stations in a particular space, right? And those spaces have to be maintained and paid for and set aside and taxed and all sorts of things. And that's also in some ways a more subtractable resource, right, than clean air. And so you might be facing two kinds of commons problems, or one kind of commons problem and one CSR problem at the end of the day, right? That is, under what conditions should, people that establish these plants be responsible for the externalities in the surrounding areas, right? And so you might consider looking at the CSR literature in that regard. But back to Ken's question, right? This question of like, okay, if it's beneficial to talk about this as a commons, can we be more specific about the nature of the commons problem? And does that then help us figure out whether it's more useful or not?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. And I have to say, Ken is one of my law school classmates, and it's so nice to see you here. So you've asked the central question that I'm grappling with. I mean, on multiple levels. I mean, first of all, do I even want to use a commons framing here? Does it advance what we're doing? And my instinct at this point is yes, that there's what has to happen for there to be transformation is not better administration of the system that we have, because the system that we have shuts communities out from an active role in defining how their communities will be shaped and used, and gives them at best a reactive role once plans have already been developed. So the goal is to give people a way in and a right in at the beginning of the process. And that's sort of the analogy that I'm trying to use, that I'm again, still developing, to participatory budgeting, where communities speak first and last. And the city machinery of technocratic expertise turns in the middle with the ideas that the community has brought to the city, and then brings that back to the community in a sort of fleshed out form for final approval. And that kind of an approach, it seems to me, to be what Sheila Foster's work is doing such a good job of eliciting in the right to the city more commonly. Now, I mean, more broadly, I should say, rather than commonly. So I think there's a reason to do this. I take your point that it's important to lay out much more clearly what we actually have. And like I said, this is a very early sort of draft, just throwing out the ideas for purposes of discussion. So, that is, well, and as you see, I'm leaning down, I'm taking notes like crazy, because even though this is recorded, it's super helpful for me to note things down. But I really do think that there's a possibility, and it's a combination, going back to Brian's point, is I think it's a combination of the political moment and the legal framing. Because we're in a political moment in New York City where things can happen. And in particular, we're in a moment where we're going to have a new mayor and we're going to have a largely new city council in a year. So it's really a moment where if ideas are out there and they're part of the discourse, they could shape what the people coming into the legislative branch and the executive branch think their job is, and think their approach to solving these kinds of collective problems should be. So I really think there's a tremendous value in offering a different framing. And it's not just the environmental justice framing. And when I say just, I don't mean just in a small sense, because environmental justice has been a tremendously powerful force for transforming the city, but it doesn't get far enough in terms of, by itself, in terms of having the very sort of machinery of the city be much more in the hands of the people of the city, rather than the people of the city responding to proposals that are brought to them, if they get to respond, and they don't always even get to respond. So that's a very long-winded response. I thank you both so much for those comments, and I hope I responded in some fashion. And I see, actually, can I just say, Jill, could you do me a favor and copy down all of the citations that people are tossing into the
Sure.
chat? Thank you.
So thanks, Rebecca. The queue as it stands right now is Nicholas, and then Lulu, and then Anita. At that point, we'll be starting to press close to the clock. So Rebecca, I'm just going to ask you, we have, when speakers are able to, we have sometimes just left the Zoom open, formally adjourned at 1 o'clock, but if people still have questions or want to engage in further discussion. So depending on your schedule, if you don't mind hanging around for a few additional minutes, maybe 10 or 15 minutes after 1 o'clock.
I'm delighted.
Okay.
The more you guys give me, the happier I am.
That's great. Okay, so Nicholas, then Lulu, then Anita. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I think this connects back to some of Ken's points, which is, so with the rights framing, and this is inspired by kind of your last couple of slides, Rebecca, the causation problem, right? So someone's infringed on a right and caused harm. Well, we have such a tangled set of causations of the harms of this population, right? That tying any particular harm or health effect to this waste plant strikes me as a nightmare, especially before a skeptical judge, and through the appeals process, you're almost guaranteed to hit one of those, right? So maybe that might be one way to contrast some other approach, right? A way of sidestepping what might be a defect in the legal system, because we think that there's an actual causation, but not legally provable or something like that causation outside of sort of our legal tools or tort tools, though I'm speaking way out of my expertise here. And then the other kind of just last quick point is, so it makes sense that we're talking about New York City as like kind of a closed unit here. And as someone who has multiple degrees from NYU, I totally embrace that. Okay. But it's a little weird to be thinking about that if we're thinking that we might really kind of reinvent the wheel, right? To, like, how open policymaking could be, right? Because maybe there are really good reasons for this, right? And maybe this highlights kind of the problems of the intractable trade-offs that maybe justify community input, right? You have two things, right? Maybe shipping stuff outside the city has like a transportation cost or something, and the community can trade those off or something like that. And that would justify maybe community input. I don't know. But, you know, New York City is a whole lot of people densely populated together. You might think, okay, let's just ship trash out to, I don't know, northern Ottawa or something like that.
Virginia or Ohio or Pennsylvania or North Carolina.
Indiana.
Yeah. Maybe Indiana. So, I mean, New York has separately embarked on a 0 by 50 campaign, which with the goal of ending the shipment of solid waste to out-of-state landfills by 2050. So, and, you know, like a lot of people have looked at the transferring of solid waste from communities that generate it to communities that are the hosts to it, and done the kind of participatory analyses of, you know, why should I have to host your waste? That's the macrocosm of what's going on in New York City with the waste transfer stations in the microcosm. And to some degree, you just have to put boundaries around the problem in order to talk about it. But I you know, this like the true problem here is we have a throughput single-use society that generates vast quantities of waste. That solving that problem is a huge undertaking, and certainly there are lots of different groups that are attacking bits and pieces of that. But I don't think that solving the problems in terms of equity about how we handle the waste that we have has to wait for that. So I don't know if I talked past you or I connected with your points. I mean, I think they're, I think you're all getting at what I am sort of sensing is a core weakness here and that needs a lot more thought and fleshing out. And I agree with that. That's part of why I brought it to you guys.
Thank you. Lulu, you're up next.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm sorry, I don't have any background in environmental justice or social justice, but I would say it's more of my personal confusion than giving suggestion, because I just know what exactly is environmental justice. For me, it's a very personal subject value. So whose justice? For example, the upper class environmental justice might be too expensive for lower income family to even afford it. So no rights is independent from other rights. How it interact with rights to food and income. In African people sometimes don't even have enough food. How you can restrict the economic activity for environment. I mean, the environment is important, but it might make them too starving. So my impression is the justice is just too wide and vague, and it's intangible. So yeah, so that's how I feel.
Thank you for those comments, and you are pointing out that I should have included a slide defining what environmental justice is. That might have been helpful. So environmental justice has an actual legal meaning in the United States. It comes from an executive order that was issued by Bill Clinton in 1990 something, 6, I think maybe. Executive Order 12898 that defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in decisions that affect them regarding the environment. It's a riff off of a document that was created in 1990 at the first National People of Colors Conference that laid out a very sophisticated and complex and much more transformative vision of what environmental justice is. But in the United States, and certainly in New York state law and New York City law, environmental justice doesn't necessarily mean an outcome. It means fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people in making choices that affect them about the environment. So I don't think that as such, environmental justice threatens any of the rights that you were talking about. It's really about how society as a whole is going to share out benefits and burdens, and who gets to be part of the conversation in which those choices are made.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, so even there is executive order, it's also different to say what's the benefits, what's the cost, what's the goal, what's the outcome. So I would say I'm more empirical, and my research is more about empirical testing. So I might have a little, so I think my question may be too narrow for your research, but I just don't know how I can measure that, and how can, if I cannot measure, how I can say the policy is implemented, successfully achieve its goal or not.
Yeah, that's actually a big fight, is how do you decide whether or not there's been meaningful involvement? The tactic that's used typically is how many people attended a meeting, regardless of whether or not they got to speak at the meeting, whether what was presented to them at the meeting had any room for them to shape the outcome. And I think that's one of the challenges in environmental justice, is coming up with metrics that measure what does it mean to say that there is meaningful involvement in policymaking, as opposed to box checking, which is what a lot of the public consultation dwindles into, because there's, and that's what I'm trying to react to here in this paper is, public consultation. Every one of these laws has public consultation built into it, but it's often pro forma. And the little story that I was telling about the Environmental Justice Advisory Board and our attempt to try to turn pro forma consultation into something meaningful and substantive is part of what I'm trying to use commons theory to get us to. And I'm not yet convinced whether we can or not, like whether it can do that work, but that's what trying to grapple with. So I don't think your question is too narrow. I think it's an important question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. I've got Anita and then Jamie, and then we probably will get pretty close to 1 o'clock at that point. So Anita, you're up.
Great, thanks. Well, it's a nice segue from all the prior conversations, especially your comments on the definitions of environmental justice. And I guess as I see it, there's two things that I'm hearing from you and what I'm reading in the paper that you're trying to do. And one is to make the argument about distributed justice, and the other is to make the argument about procedural justice. And what I see is kind of the area that needs to be filled in a little more detail to help make this much more clear. Well, first, decide which of the two it is that is really strong. And I think clearly procedural justice may or may not lead to distributive justice. But that there's sort of two different arguments that I'm hearing. And one is that you want to be using the commons theory as a way of, and the human rights aspect as a way of justifying the greater inclusion of people in the governance and helping to have them be greater involved in the decision-making process. And if that's the line of reasoning in the thesis statement, so to speak, is that because they have this right, they should be more involved in the governance decision-making, then I would argue that it would be useful to then turn more towards theories of governance and why people are there and what their role should be and how people should be involved in procedural and decision-making processes, to then kind of explain and make the connection between why commons then leads towards the demand for procedural justice, because I feel like that link is a little tenuous right now. And when I read and hear about the commons aspects, then I think more just about rights and who has the who should have the clean air and who should have the access to the water and who gets to decide, but that that procedural aspect is missing, and it could easily be misinterpreted as not one of your key arguments. And so I think what I'm trying to suggest is to decide whether it's both about procedural and distributive justice, or if the paper is going to be more focused on procedural justice, and then to sort of dig deeper into connecting the dots between them to help the reader understand which it is you're arguing for a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a really helpful point. One of the frustrations in environmental justice advocacy is that there seems to be this belief that procedural justice will lead to substantive justice. And I guess we haven't seen if it would or not, because we haven't really seen what procedural justice would look like. But part of what I'm hoping that commons theory can do is give more of a substantive hook here too, because we can flesh out the claim for procedural justice and access to process and different processes. I think we can flesh that out fairly well without even mentioning anything about a commons or even mentioning a human right to breathe clean air. Where those ideas can do some work, I think, is in articulating a claim to substantive justice, which again gets us back to Lulu's point about what does substantive justice mean in such a profoundly unequal world, and does substantive justice for some jeopardize the survival of others. And I don't subscribe to that sort of Kuznets theory vision of environmental protection, but it certainly is a strain that's out there. But what I think, I take the point that I need to definitely separate those and develop those strains more. And, you know, obviously when this is a 50-page paper, it will do that much more. But as somebody said to me, nobody objects to only having to read a 15-page draft for a conference. But I really want to think hard about whether there is a way to use commons theory, maybe commons theory buttressed by human rights theory, to advance a substantive claim to environmental justice, not just a procedural claim.
All right, thank you. Jamie is up, and for right now, that's the cue, but that's okay because it's 12:56. So what we may do after Jamie's question and Rebecca has a chance to respond to it is we may formally adjourn. And then if people want to hang around a little bit longer, we'll just leave the Zoom channel open. Jamie?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And thank you, Ms. Bratspies, for your really fascinating work. You have so many interesting problems that are nested together. So it seems like addressing one problem might help you actually address others too, which is really cool. One thing that hasn't come up in our conversation yet is this question of, well, sort of, it has tangentially, but I think to really put a label on it, it's a question of ownership, right? Like, you know, who gets to define what happens in the neighborhood, but like, who has ownership over the stuff that has become trash, you know, and what are the cultural perceptions of that? Like, does it stop being mine just because I threw it in a waste bin somewhere? And I know that seems like a silly question, but I think this question differs depending on where you live. For instance, you know, I don't know how New York City handles their trash. Are there any public trash barriers, for instance, who will cart trash away for people? I know I didn't know that was a thing because I grew up in, you know, neighborhoods where the city took care of trash until when I was in my teens, we moved to a neighborhood that was where you hired private people. And so now like there's 3 trash companies that come through our neighborhood. So in a sense, like, you know, that trash was sort of still ours. We had to figure out a way how to dispose of it, or, you know, definitely pay somebody to come take it off if we didn't want to cart it to the dump ourselves. And so I think that's an interesting question to ask, is who owns your trash? Do you still own your trash? Are you still responsible for that when you put it in the trash bin? Or, and that might also help get at like what's one of the foundational problems of this whole bigger complex you have here.
Yeah, so, you know, funny you should say that. There's a project that I ran in New York City public schools about a decade ago called Who's Trash? And it was, you know, both about who owns the trash and which communities are considered trash for purposes of that. It was really a fun thing that we did with the students. So New York City has both systems you describe. For residential waste, Disney, which is the Department of Sanitation of New York, collects residential waste. For commercial waste, however, it is private haulers who collect the commercial waste and take it to the waste transfer. The same waste transfer stations are used for Disney waste and for private hauled waste. And in fact, the law that is being fleshed out right now in terms of waste hauling in New York is directed at those commercial waste companies to try to reduce the vehicle miles traveled in New York City hauling commercial waste. So what the city's going to do is it's going to designate a series of zones and then give not quite monopoly contracts, because there'll be 3 haulers, but 3 haulers will be licensed within each zone so that there won't be so many haulers crisscrossing the city. And it is expected to reduce vehicle miles by about 1 million. And my hope is that as part of that process, they will tighten up the requirements for trucks that can be used in the commercial waste hauling, because in 2007, EPA adopted truck standards that dramatically, like 92%, reduce nitrous oxide emissions and particulate matters. And the Trump administration dialed back on those restrictions and didn't require trucks on the road to meet the 2007 standards. But the plan had been, and I'm hoping will be again, that in order to serve ports or in order to participate in the commercial hauling zones, trucks will have to meet those standards. And those two changes will make a dramatic difference in terms of the air quality in the cities. But I agree with you. It's a really interesting question of like, when we throw something away, what does that mean? You know, I was playing with the idea of, is there a place called away? But is it still mine? You know, for Fourth Amendment purposes, we know in terms of search and seizure, it's not mine once I put it on the curb. But in terms of responsibility for environmental impacts, should it still be mine? You know, what does that mean? How does, and we see that in the hortatory campaigns to reduce waste, to, you know, to not throw things away, to not participate in single-use society. But there's no legal there as far as I know. And that's a very interesting question. Thank you so much for it. This has been so thought-provoking. I really can't thank you enough for including me in this colloquium and letting me present my very early stage work.
Well, we thank you very much, Rebecca. Very thought-provoking and enjoyable read and discussion today. Scott, I'm going to hand it back to you for any final announcements before we adjourn.
Thank you so much, Bill. And thanks again, Rebecca. That was brilliant. A virtual round of applause, at least, from our homes and offices. Thank you. Thank you. I obviously can't wait to see the final product. I thought that was just fantastic. And then in the interest of time, since we're out of time, everybody, just remember that we do have a research series coming up this week as well with Michael. That's going to be a lot of fun. Michael Roberts from UMass Amherst talking about uncharted groundwater. And there's also a variety of working group meetings coming up as well, including the polycentricity working group. So for those of you active in that, remember that's coming up as well later this week. And in the meantime, happy early St. Patrick's Day. Be safe, be well. Rebecca, thank you so much again for taking the time. And are we keeping you on the line for a few minutes for final questions and thoughts? Is that
Absolutely.
okay,
If anybody has anything, I'm delighted to hear it.
Excellent.
And
Excellent.
just to chat.
So, even better, right? Absolutely. Yeah. So we'll keep the line open, but for everybody that needs to jump off, thank you for joining. Look forward to seeing you soon. And thanks again, Rebecca. That was brilliant. And thank you.